His name is Dr. Michael Guillen. He is the former news science editor for ABC News. He was actually the first person to report from the wreck of the Titanic back in 2000, that 2.5 miles below the surface. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. You had a pretty terrifying accident during that voyage. In fact, Doctor, if we can, let's just play a quick clip from that report.
As we approach the stern of the ship, we're suddenly caught up in a strong underwater current that pushes us towards one of the gigantic 21-ton propellers.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh, look at the size of that thing. Look at the blade, it's still clean, like it's brand new.
But when we try to back out...
I felt a little bit of a boom, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, look at these things.
Oh my God, look at the size of these things.
Oh my gosh, so are we stuck or what?
As this graphic shows, we appear to be somehow wedged beneath the wreck of the stern.
Dr. Guillen, I mean, I can't even fathom what must have been going through your mind in that moment.
You know, Gowdy, I've had to relive it all this week, and it's agonizing for me because I feel such a kinship to the people who lost their lives. And it's interesting in listening to PH's stepson, who so eloquently spoke about him and his love of the ocean. I was just the opposite. When I received the invitation to be the first TV correspondent to report from the Titanic, my inclination was to decline because I have a deathly fear of water. I don't even know how to swim. And so I thought, of all the things, I don't want to do that. But then, of course, it's my job. So I went down there and everything went smoothly. I mean, the dive took us about 2.5 hours down. We went to the hull of the bow of the ship. We had a moment of prayer. But as you saw on that videotape, we got caught between the poop deck, the inverted poop deck, and the blades of this giant propeller. The propeller's much bigger than our sub. And you know, it's like when you're driving on a beautiful sunny day and you think you're on top of the world, you're admiring the scenery, and then boom, all of a sudden somebody just T-bones you. That was my initial reaction. It's like, what just happened? Wait a minute. And once that was clarified, I understood that we were in a life-threatening situation. But as a scientist, I immediately started wondering, well, there has to be a way out of this thing, right? But very quickly I realized there wasn't. And hitting that brick wall made me feel enormously sad, as if the entire weight of the Atlantic Ocean above me, 2.5 miles of water, just kind of descended on my shoulders. I'll never forget that. It was terrifying.
Something happened that changed the atmosphere within that sub. It went from kind of chaos to, there was a peace that kind of just settled into the whole sub. Not just with me, but it just kind of inhabited the entire sub, and it was quick. It was almost what we call in science a discontinuity. Didn't ramp up to that, it was just here, and then it was here. And then I felt a tremendous peace, and I just surrendered to the moment, and I was ready to give up my life.
Wow, isn't that incredible? Michael Guillen was the first ever correspondent and newsperson to go into the depth of the Titanic wreckage and come out of there alive. When I first saw his story about him going into the wreckage of the Titanic on a submarine, after reading his amazing book, Believing is Seeing, which is right here, I'm holding it up for those who are watching this on screen. Believing is Seeing is one of the best books that he's written. He's written a few books about mathematics and the belief in God, and how the belief in God doesn't have to go against science. But when I first heard of his story in this book and then saw the news coverage, as you just seen, about him going to the wreckage of Titanic, I was amazed, because a few months ago there was a few people that went to the wreckage of Titanic in the submarine that was actually crushed underneath the ocean and exploded. And Michael Guillen was actually brought out in a lot of news channels to talk about his experience of seeing the Titanic and then surviving it, because he could have almost died. Seeing his story actually shows me that there is something beyond the logical, reasonable aspect of our universe. There's a translogic reality to the idea that prayer does do something in the human experience, that there is something beyond us that we can't see. In this book, Believing is Seeing, you guys have to read it because it is amazing. It's talking about how his story of being a scientist, where he earned 3 PhDs in astronomy, physics, and mathematics, him coming to believe that he had to accept a lot of axiomatic truth in all of these three fields by faith. And that showed him that just because he earned these 3 PhDs, that there was a lot of truth that had to be discovered by a lot of the people that created this field and evolved it over time, like Einstein and Kurt Gödel, which created the theory that it's almost impossible to prove everything with logic. It was called the incompleteness theorem. And you guys will discover it in this book that he writes about. So everything he learned through these three fields that he got 3 PhDs in. So this guy is not an idiot. He's not a dummy. For those who are atheists watching this, you guys should stick around to watch that. It's amazing seeing that this physicist, who actually studied under Carl Sagan, one of the most famous scientists on television as well, and he met a lot of very famous people, especially Stephen Hawking too. He discovered that everything in his life was actually taken by faith, and that his journey in discovering God's existence was actually a logical and reasonable step that ended up in him fully surrendering his life to the evidence of who Jesus Christ was. Because he says that you can't prove really anything. Can I prove to you that your brain is inside your head? I can show you evidence because of other people that have a brain. And can I prove to you what you're thinking right now? What I'm thinking right now, can I prove it to you? I can't, because it's in my consciousness. And I can't just open up my brain and show you the exact cell or the synapse that's firing, that's giving me the thought that I'm thinking of right now, that I'm telling you right now. So the thing is that a lot of these things are accepted by faith, a lot of these axioms. And one thing that struck me was a lot of stuff that I learned in high school, like Euclid's geometry, a lot of that stuff is accepted by faith, because Euclid actually came up with 33 axioms and beliefs, mathematical proofs that he couldn't actually prove it logically, but he came up with postulates and definitions for things that were actually pretty obvious to us. Kind of things that are equal to the same thing are also equal to one another, and the whole is greater than a part. So these things are actually obvious, and we can actually understand that, yeah, a whole is greater than its parts. But the thing is, these are logical assertions that can be verified, but other axioms that he came up with aren't easily verifiable. They have to be accepted by faith. Like this one in the book, Believing is Seeing, Michael Guillen mentions one of the axioms that Euclid defined a point as something with no width, depth, nor length. It's both something and nothing, just like the quantum vacuum, which physicists have now are saying that before the Big Bang there was a quantum vacuum where everything then exploded and began to exist. And Michael Guillen is a physicist that discovered and studied all that. So the thing is that even Euclid himself came up with axioms and postulates that could not be scientifically proven or by logic. It had to be accepted by trans-logic. It had to be accepted as a truth by faith. And then after he believed that, then he saw it, all these other axioms, and then you came up with the Euclid's geometry and about parallel lines meeting together, because they won't ever meet together on a straight line, but on a curved surface they will meet together. So that's why there's a lot of truth that are actually not as logical as we think. Logic fails at physics, astronomy, and mathematics. And even in faith, a lot of things are accepted by faith, like the existence of God, the Jesus resurrecting from the dead, which was a historical event, but because we didn't see it, we have to accept it by faith, although there's evidence pointing to that physical resurrection, which is another video that I've done. But the thing is, there's things that are accepted by faith doesn't mean that they're not true. It just means that they go beyond the logical proofs that we can show on paper to prove something. And I just gave you a short overview of his book, Believing is Seeing, and you guys have to check it out. And I want to leave you guys with this, that Michael Guillen's testimony that I'm going to play after this is incredible. He goes from his young life when he was at Cornell as a student, and then he went to get his 3 PhDs, and he loved science. He worshiped science. And he was really smart. He still is very smart. And then he became ABC News editor, won 3 Emmys for his newscast shows that he did. So this guy is very smart, absolutely incredibly smart. The thing is, a lot of people haven't even heard of Michael Guillen. They've heard a lot of atheist scientists came to Christ, but this guy is kind of like a hidden gem. So as you guys listen to the interview, open up your mind to the fact that I'm listening to, or you're listening to, a guy who actually did not believe in God at all. He was a total atheist, and he went to search all these other different religions a Hinduism, a Buddhism, Islam, Judaism. And then through all these other religions, he discovered that they did not have the axiomatic truth that were found in Christ and Christianity. That after he discovered that, that's when he became a Christian. And it's incredible as you hear his journey, because you will understand certain things from a mathematical perspective and a physicist perspective that you probably have never heard anywhere else. I urge you guys to really listen and watch the whole interview, because it will blow your mind. God bless you and enjoy the interview.
I went into Cornell with the intention of going into experimental elementary physics. You have to understand, in physics, there is this huge divide between experimental and theory. It's true, actually, of most sciences, but especially in the physical sciences. And so I petitioned about a year and a half in. I just had a change of heart. I won't get into the whole story, but I petitioned to go from experimental to theoretical. That was a big deal. That's not easily done, and I needed to get the approval of Hans Bethe, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who was a faculty member at Cornell. He was on the top floor of LNS. So I was here in the basement. He was up there on the 8th floor. And he's the man who got the Nobel Prize for figuring out how the sun shines. And he set certain challenges to me. I passed the challenges, so I was able to go to theory. So suddenly I was able to spend all this time not just tinkering in my lab, making things and doing things experimentally, but I literally had permission now to just think. Just think about the universe. Do my math and just think and figure out solutions to problems that were facing us as physicists. And that was the point where I began interrogating myself and interrogating science about asking deep questions, and I was not getting answers that satisfied me, and especially ones in cosmology. I was particularly interested in the origins of the universe, asking a very simple but profound question: how did the universe come to be? And by then, of course, I had an intimate relationship with the universe. I knew it like the back of my hand. It was my best friend. And so when I found that I wasn't getting the answers that satisfied my curiosity, and we have the standard cosmological model, I was very familiar with it, and so forth, general relativity and all this sort of thing. And so I thought, well, if I can't get answers to my deep questions from my beloved science, where am I going to look? I mean, this has been my entire world. And that's when I remember one of my professors, Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer. He was just getting to be famous at that point. He was getting the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and he was doing Cosmos, and I was on the front lines of all that. And I remember Carl always talking about the Vedas. He was always quoting the Vedas. He was Jewish, but he was a secular Jew, and he had an interest. As I'm this young man trying to find an answer, asking these jillion questions, but this one in particular: how did this universe come to be? I knew about dark matter by then and all this sort of thing. I'm not going to get into all that, but it was a profound question for me to ask, and it was important for me to understand an answer to that. So I thought, well, Carl is talking about the Vedas. I have no idea what the Vedas are, but they're important to him, and I admire him and respect him. So I went to Olin Library and I looked up the Vedas, and sure enough, it was the sacred literature of the Hindu religion, which is generally considered to be the oldest religion, belief system in the world. So as I do everything, I dove in with both hands and both feet. I never do anything halfway. Whatever I commit to, whatever I'm curious about, I'm wired to just exhaust it. I just need to know everything about it. Not some things about it, everything about it. So I basically became a Hindu, and I found it quite actually interesting. I think the Hindu religion is quite fascinating. And then I remember getting a copy of the I Ching from a friend of mine who I guess realized that I was on this weird journey. I was immersed in Hermann Hesse. I was reading all his novels. I was identifying with his protagonists, these tormented intellectuals in search of the meaning of life. And I said, that's me at this point. And so I got the copy of the I Ching. I started reading it. It's pretty interesting. So I immersed myself in Buddhism and Confucianism, Taoism. And then one thing led to another. Transcendental meditation at that time was very popular. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was making the rounds of universities at that time. I attended his seminars. I loved it because they said if you became a devotee of TMI, Transcendental Meditation, you could levitate. I thought, hey, I could defy gravity. You know, that appealed to the scientist in me. You know, and I thought, ooh, I want to check that out. Plus, I was an amateur magician, so I'm thinking, you know, this is probably just a trick. But I want to find out for myself if this is the real deal. And I saw pictures of people levitating. I'm thinking, I got to get to the bottom of that, again, with just curiosity. And then my thesis advisor, Richard Lieboff, may he rest in peace, was Jewish, so he started taking me to Shabbat services on Friday. Then we had a little Oneg Shabbat afterwards at his house. And then Islam, and just on and on and on, and Baha'i. And I was just interested. At this point, I was now, okay, if science can't answer some basic questions that I'm asking, then who can? What can? So gloves were off. And as I said, everything's on the table with me. I question everything. And yeah, so that was an interesting period in my life. I was of the mind that unless I can see it, I won't believe it. Ghosts or angels or anything like that. It's like, no, fantasy land. And so one of the jarring things was when I was in grad school and I started learning about dark matter, and this was a profound discovery that was made in the 30s by an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky. He was a Swiss-American astronomer working out of Caltech at Mount Wilson in Pasadena. Pasadena, Michelle. Michelle is from Pasadena, one of my wonderful guests tonight. And without getting too crazy, we look at galaxies and we look at clusters of galaxies, and we notice that they're spinning like carousels. And there is something called the virial theorem that relates the rate of spin to the mass of the object. So the more massive the object, the faster it spins. Okay, that's the virial theorem in a nutshell. And so Zwicky was looking at images of spiral galaxies and galaxy clusters, and he said, these things are spinning a whole lot faster than they should be. What's causing that? At first he thought it was an error. He kept looking, no, it's not an error. This is a real thing. This is not an artifact of some mistake. And so he said there has to be something within that cluster of galaxies that's driving this extra spin, and he came up with the name Dunkelmaterie, which is German for dark matter. And so I was learning this in grad school. We didn't call it dark matter by then. At that time, they were calling it the missing mass problem. And it was, for us as budding scientists, we had to figure out, okay, how do we solve this missing mass problem? What is this stuff exactly within the galaxy that our telescopes can't see? Is it a form of matter, or is it something completely different? And honestly, we still don't know. After all these years, we still don't know, but we still call it something. Anyway, we're good at naming things we don't understand in science. That's a little dirty little secret, okay? So think about that, James. Here I'm learning that, and later on very quickly, we learned that about 27% of the universe, or our part of the universe, is made of dark matter. So what I was learning is that 27% of our universe, I can't see it. So how can I keep possibly living by the motto, seeing is believing? Think about it. It just doesn't make any sense, because otherwise I have to concede that I have to believe in at least 27% of the universe that I can't see. So that I knew I had to ditch that motto. I just didn't know what to replace it with. When I was in the midst of my Hermann Hesse-like journey, and I was learning about all these religions, naturally, I wanted to compare them. And being a scientist, what better way to do it than to create a matrix? And I wanted to interrogate every belief system. And I've only got 3 of them here because we only have a limited amount of time. But I did this for all the other religions that I immersed myself in. And I wanted, it's like when you go shopping online, like on Amazon or something like that, and you're thinking about, well, I want to get this maybe lawnmower, and then they allow you to compare, the different lawnmowers. That's what I was really doing here. It was very, very straightforward. And I was shocked by what I discovered. And so this slide here, let's just go through this very, very briefly. I'm going to just show you, and this is you have to understand this is a tiny part of the actual matrix, which is much larger. It's like, 10 by 20 or something like that. So this is a 3 by 3. And questions that I wanted to ask is, does absolute truth exist? Pretty straightforward question. Does it? It either does or it doesn't. Are there truths that cannot be proven? And is the universe designed for life? 3 very straightforward questions. I didn't have a prejudice as to the answer, but I wanted to find out each of these worldviews, what do they have to say about the answers? So here I go. I advance this like this. So the first one is scientific. Does absolute truth exist? Yes, of course, because otherwise there would be no science. And a lot of people make this mistake, and again, I know our time is limited, so I got to keep this going. So forgive me if I zip through this and I leave you wondering. A lot of this is in my book and so forth and so on. But let's go back to that, Rich, and that is even the theory of relativity. Let's take special theory of relativity. Everybody says, well, even science says truth is relative. Well, it's true and not true. Because you have to understand that even the things that are relative, which is anything having to do with energy, mass, space, and time, those are relative truths. Those are not absolute truths. But their relativeness is determined by an absolute equation, the equations of relativity. You understand? So, but people say, they abuse the theory of relativity to excuse their belief in that all truth is relative. It's just not true. All right, so then what about the question, are there truths that cannot be proven? Yes, I've just explained to you, Gödel's theorem. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Is the universe designed for life? This is one of the most astonishing things we have discovered in the 20th century. In the late 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st century, there's a fantastic book by Sir Martin Rees, who's an atheist. He's the Astronomer Royal in Great Britain. Brilliant man. He wrote a book called Just 6 Numbers. And it talks about what I describe as the vital signs of the universe. Again, I have to zip through this, so forgive me. But when you go to the doctor and checks your vital signs to see how you're doing, well, we do that to the universe. The universe has vital signs. And we call them natural constants. But think of them as vital signs. And we now are very good at determining the numerical value of these constants, these vital signs. And guess what? They all have precisely the value needed for life to exist in the universe. Precisely. A little bit too much, a little bit too little, there wouldn't be life. Not just on Earth, but the entire universe. Okay, so the answer is yes. Let's look at the atheist worldview, which was my worldview at the time, clearly. Does absolute truth exist? No. We felt that, all truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth. The answer to the question, are there truths that cannot be proven? The answer is no. Bertrand Russell, for example, was famous atheist, brilliant mathematician, said, if I can't prove it, I can't believe it. It's not true. If I can't prove it, I can't true. So he's using logic as kind of the gold standard for determining whether something is true or not. And then, is the universe designed for life? Absolutely not. The standard kind of atheist point of view is that, in physics, at least in the standard standard cosmological model, is we believe the vacuum, the quantum vacuum, which is everything and nothing. I can't get into it. It's a very translogical concept. Created the universe. So it's not designed for life. So the Christian worldview, which was the one I was kind of exploring when I met with Laurel, does absolute truth exist? Of course. One of those being that this God described in the Bible exists. Are there truths that cannot be proven? Yes. I can't prove to you that God exists. It's one of those kind of Gödelian truths. That you just can't prove. So when somebody says to you, believe in God, prove it, they don't know what they're asking. It's a silly question. It's a meaningless question. And then finally, is the universe designed for life? Of course, yes. The biblical point of view, Genesis is spelled out in Genesis, is, yeah, of course, it was intentional. It wasn't an accident. So when I looked at that matrix, Rich, let's stay on it for a moment. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? You have to understand, I was fully invested in that middle column. I was living by an atheist point of worldview. When I looked at this, I couldn't believe my eyes because I saw, wait a minute, how can I be a scientist and an atheist? Something doesn't compute. They're completely at odds with one another. And yet, look at Christianity, and so the Christian worldview is much more in step with the scientific worldview. That I had to ponder for a long time.
Okay, let's go to the experience with the Titanic.
The what?
Titanic.
Yes, okay.
And let's talk about how in those frightening moments,
Yes.
God met you.
Well, as you could see in the tank, in the submarine, it was chaos when we collided with the propeller. See, when the Titanic sank, it broke into two pieces. And then the stern did a somersault, and it landed on its back. And so when you go down there and you start at the bow, there's a debris fill in the middle. This is where you see all the suitcases, ladies' shoes, and medicine cabinets, cases of champagne. So when we got stuck down there, there was chaos. And my diving buddy, Brian Cook, is a British comedy writer, but he wasn't laughing. And Victor, I found out, was a former MiG pilot and very solid, but during this chaos, I could hear the communications through the hydrophones, very watery sound, very creepy, very scary. And Brian kept saying, he was concerned, and so was I, honestly. But I kind of got into my scientific mode. I'm a problem solver. I'm a professional problem solver, and so I kept thinking to myself, "There's got to be a way out of this. This is a problem that has a solution." And I soon realized that it isn't. There is no solution to this. I'm 2.5 miles down below the surface. There's just no way. You can't call AAA to come tow you out. There's just no. So I was faced with the words in my mind came very clear. I'll never forget. This is how it's going to end for you. Those were the words that came into my mind. And then I thought of Laurel. And I thought, wow, I've been all over the world. I've been to the North Pole, the South Pole. I've done all these things, and this is how it's going to end for you. And then something quite strange happened, and because I'm a reporter and I'm a scientist, I'm simply going to tell you, you make out of it what you want. I'm simply going to try to report it to you as faithfully as I can. Something happened that changed the atmosphere within that sub. It went from kind of chaos to there was a peace that kind of just settled into the whole sub. Not just with me, but it just kind of inhabited the entire sub, and it was quick. It was almost what we call in science a discontinuity. Didn't ramp up to that. It was just here, and then it was here. And then I felt a tremendous peace, and I just surrendered to the moment, and I was ready to give up my life. Then, fortunately, Victor got us out, and I don't know how he did it, but and then it took us 2.5 hours to get back up. So I had a lot of time to think about what had just happened. And it wasn't until much later, Laurel and I were reading the Bible, and there's this psalm, I think it's like Psalm 139, and it speaks about wherever I go, I'll be there. And there's a passage that particularly struck me because it says, even if you're at the depths of the sea.
May I read the verse?
Yeah.
It reads like this, Psalm 139, 9 and 10. It says, if I take up the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will take hold of me.
Yeah. And that pretty much describes as best I can what happened to me down there. And so I was still exploring Christianity. This was, for me, I think, I don't want to say it's a test, but it ended up being that. It was like, okay, how do you explain this, Guillen? And it wasn't until, I think that was like in 98 I went down there. It wasn't until like 2002 or something like that, Laurel, where I really just dropped the other shoe and I said, you know what, the journey has brought me here. You just have to accept it. This is where the evidence has led you. Be honest about it. Be intellectually honest about it. It's the Christian worldview that really makes the most sense given everything. And here's the thing for me. It was my scientific brain. So the whole idea, he dies and he's comes back to life. Why? The Bible claims, the New Testament, that he lived and died to reconcile us with God. So immediately in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, well, this really boils down to a simple algebraic equation, which is God is perfection, right? We're imperfection. So how in the world do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? So this is, okay, now, Rich, you can show it. So for me, this is it. You call X is the unknown in this equation, right? You have imperfection, that's us. What can I add to imperfection? What can I add to humanity? What can I add to the world that will reconcile, that will equal perfection? solve for the equation. It's a trivial. Remember algebra? You have to isolate the unknown on one side of the equation. Well, then you have to subtract the imperfection from both sides. So next slide. So what you get is x equals perfection minus imperfection. Not perfection, but perfection minus imperfection. In other words, whatever this entity is that is designed to reconcile imperfection with perfection has to not only be perfection, but has to have the power to remove imperfection. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, that's exactly what Bible calls Jesus. So for me, that was, again, it was like I didn't have to, it didn't challenge my mind very much. That was pretty easy. Yeah, I mean, that was easy. Yeah.
So the death of Jesus as an atonement for us
Yes.
to heal the breach between creature and creator.
That's what it's all about. How do you reconcile
perfection?
perfection with imperfection? That's quite an interesting problem. How do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? And unless you solve that problem, there's going to be animus between perfection and imperfection. And of course, that's the Old Testament. How do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? Bingo, X, Jesus.
There you go.
And then he talks the way he does. Woof, fascinating. Anyway, go ahead.
All right, the resurrection.
The resurrection, again, I mean, if you want to think about it strictly from a scientific point of view. The concept that something would be destroyed and be thoroughly destroyed is not scientific. When we study the universe, everything is about something will be destroyed, but something is always conserved. I can't get into it. It's a fascinating subject, okay? But we have what we call conservation laws, that when you destroy something, let's say I take a sledgehammer to a watch. I have a watch here, I take a sledgehammer. You think, I destroyed that watch, it's done. That's a human being, he's dead. There's nothing left. Boom, it's over. It's like Stephen Hawking, I was the first correspondent to interview Stephen because we had met at Harvard. He was very shy about being interviewed, but I actually flew to England. He trusted me, and I interviewed him and his wife and his young son at the time, Tim. But Stephen would say, may he rest in peace, that, when you die, you die. It's lights out. He had a very typical atheist point of view. It was my point of view for many times. And other people would say the same thing. Dawkins will say things. Death is death. It's over. Curtains come down. There's like nothing. Well, that's not scientific. So if you want to take a scientific point of view, you have to say, no, when you destroy that watch, mass is conserved, electric charge is conserved, energy is conserved, other things are conserved. So in almost every situation where the universe goes through a very dramatic turmoil or a dramatic change, when something is destroyed, invariably things about that thing are conserved. They live on. So the whole concept of, hey, there's an afterlife, there's life after death, that was not a problem for me to understand because it was very scientifically based. It's a concept that is typical of what we know about the universe. What's not typical is something that you would claim is dead and gone forever. Everything about it is gone. No, that's violating all the laws of the universe that we know about. Here's what I always hear, and it drives me crazy, but people will say, well, the faith and science and faith. No, it's not that. You have to understand that no matter what worldview you have, and there are many worldviews represented here tonight, and I respect each and every one of them, but every one of your worldviews is ultimately founded on concepts, axioms, axiomatic beliefs that you cannot prove. You have to take on faith. So when somebody says, are you a person of faith? Everybody's a person of faith. The only question is, what do you have faith in? What is the foundation of your worldview? So when I was a scientific monk, when I had an atheist worldview, one of my axioms was seeing is believing. That was one of my axioms. I couldn't prove to you that was a great foundation stone for my worldview. There's no proof for it. I can't prove to you that the best way to live is by the motto, seeing is believing, but I believed it. It was a foundation stone of my worldview until it was knocked out from under my worldview because of what I started discovering in science. So when I hear people speaking about faith versus science, no, it's not faith versus science. Science is a faith-based enterprise. It just has faith in different things. Euclidean geometry is faith-based. Euclid had 33 axioms, one of which was mind-blowing. He said, let us define a mathematical point as something that has no dimension. No height, no width, no breadth. Well, how can it be something if it has no dimension? But you have to accept that premise on faith in order to see what Euclid came up with. So I came up with believing is seeing. I had it backwards. I put seeing ahead of believing. It's really believing is ahead of seeing. And Euclid's geometry is a perfect example of that. If you refuse to believe in his 33 axioms, you will never see for yourself what results from those 33 axioms. So the proper way to think about it is to simply say, yes, there can be, you can ask the legitimate question, is there a conflict between this Christian worldview and science? Is there a conflict between the Buddhist worldview and science? Is there a conflict between the atheist religion and science? Because atheism too is a religion. It's a worldview. It's based on faith in certain axioms. You empower randomness. You empower the quantum vacuum. So whatever worldview you have, it is faith-based. So it's not faith versus the world. It's just different worldviews see the world differently. What I have discovered, James, and sitting here, having the privilege of being here with you tonight, and I mean that quite sincerely, because there's some part of me that is still that little kid from East LA. That little Mexican kid who asked a jillion questions, who had this dream of escaping from the barrio. I wasn't athletic. Although I tell the story, you know, they would fight over me. They would say, you take him. No, you take him. You would take, you know. But I knew athletics wouldn't get me out. But when I look back on my life, I realize that somewhere along the line, I went from pursuing my dream to finding my destiny.